Hi, everyone. I'm Alice Buckley. I'm wearing two hats today. I serve as a legislator in Bozeman, represent the university
Sorry.
district.
Another cable lunch? Yeah.
I'm just gonna go ahead and mute you, Barry. And then my day job is with the Sightline Institute. That's a public policy think tank. We work on a number of different issue areas, but housing and infrastructure is one of them. So also bringing that expertise to the table here today. Mark Eggy and I will be sharing our time today. I'll just touch briefly on the context of housing in Bozeman. How did we get here? And what's the socio-political and the physical context, built landscape context that this UDC is coming to us from. And then Mark will go through both the current UDC and also the revisions to the UDC as well. Because we're just taking 30 minutes today, the intention of our time is not to be a discussion forum or even really dig into those questions. We'll have some other times to actually have an opportunity for some back and forth. But today it'll just be trying to move through the information and then say, okay, where do we go from here? What does it look like at the community development board meeting tonight? And then what happens after that? I think, Mark, I'm ready to talk about the context that this is taking place in. All right, if there's one thing I want to impart today on the context of this revised UDC, it is that our community does not have enough housing units. We simply don't have enough dwelling units either for renters or for homeowners in our community for everyone who lives and works here to make our community function. That's especially the people who are vital to have a functioning, beautiful community. I'm thinking about our nurses, our childcare workers, our firefighters, all those who are making our median wages are still around just north of 50,000 here in Gallatin County. And it's all those people who are not making enough at the moment to afford to get into a home or to afford to rent. So we just simply don't have enough dwelling units. That's really taken place over the past 10 years. We've been building for the ultra wealthy who've come in, but we haven't been building for the middle market there, or as we call it, the missing middle. We think about sprawl and how Bozeman has been growing out to the west, and we have been putting more units out there, but that's not ideally how we're trying to grow, especially when we think about why we're here, the quality of life, being able to see the mountains, having places to go outside. So as we think about basic housing economics scarcity, the fact that we don't have enough units then drives up prices, particularly land prices, and that's what's made it so hard to afford, again, to rent or to buy in Bozeman. There are solutions out there, building more units, certainly allowing them to be smaller and denser, thinking about infill, particularly in Bozeman's city center. And that's hopefully what we're getting at as we think about how to grow from here. The other context I'll say too is Bozeman has been thinking about this for a really long time. And then this past legislative session, the legislature passed a number of pieces of legislation that then we're thinking about how to align for, both allowing for more units, allowing for ADUs by right. That's another part of the context as we're thinking about how to align what's taking place in Bozeman right now with our mandate from the state legislature. Mark, just in terms of time, I will pause right there and turn to you.
Great, thanks, Alice, and thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Mark Eggy, and I'm joining this conversation. I was a member of the planning board when the current community plan was adopted, and I've had the opportunity to participate in some statewide conversations around housing and housing policy. But I think my primary credential as it applies to our call today is just having read the current code more or less in its entirety, and the draft code in its entirety. And that's really what the intent in the next 20 minutes or so is to just share some additional information about how our current code is structured and how the new code is structured, and get a little bit of comparing and contrasting between the two. But I wanted to start out by establishing, putting this into the context of kind of the last 5 years of conversation that's been happening in Bozeman around the topic of affordable housing. And I would start the timeline with the 2019 Community Housing Needs Assessment that identified a shortfall of like 5,500 units of housing that needed to be built by 2025 to meet the community's housing needs, saying we need more housing and we need more diversity in housing units. That need was reflected in the 2020 community plan, which called for promoting housing diversity, more missing middle housing types, and completing the transition to a form-based code. And then in 2021, the city completed an audit of our current development code to ask the question, like, what barriers or impediments are there in our current code that are preventing affordable housing from getting built? And there's a number of recommendations in there, all of which kind of translate directly into the current draft development code that we're talking about today. But first, with our current existing zoning code, the way that our code works currently is it prescribes specific allowed uses in specific places. And so what you see here on the screen is a map of our current residential zoning. And depending on the zone that you're in, there's a ratio that determines how many housing units you can have. And basically, it's like in some zones, you can have a single family house. In other zones, you can have a duplex or a triplex, so on and so forth. So it's very prescriptive in terms of what can be allowed where. And there's a lot of areas in town where the only allowable use would be a single family home. So there's a few challenges with our current code. One is just that we're out of land, that we're a growing city and we don't have room to grow into. That 2021 report identified that less than 5% of the city's land is zoned residential and is currently undeveloped. And a lot of that 5% is held by owners who don't want to sell or develop that land. And the city can't annex new land in the county. That all annexation has to be initiated by the private property owners. So we're running out of land. Another challenge with our current code is that we haven't allowed the core areas that are nearest to downtown that have that have better transportation options in terms of walking and biking and have more access to opportunity. We haven't allowed those to absorb some of the increase in population or some of the people that want to live here. In fact, we've been going the opposite direction, that over the last 20 years, the number of people living in the neighborhoods north and south of downtown that you see on screen here has actually declined by about 6% according to recent census data. And I think a final challenge with our current code is that there's this implied incompatibility between homeowners and renters living side by side. And this implication that renters need to be separated from homeowners, and that's just bad policy. The last problem with our current development code is that there's basically kind of a one-way valve on real estate prices. So in most areas, or in the majority of residential areas, you can replace a house on the left with a house on the right, driving costs up, as long as it's just a single family home. But you couldn't replace the house on the left with something that looked like the building on the right that was three stacked flats or internal apartments that would cost less. So we kind of have this one-way valve that allows houses to get replaced with more expensive houses, but doesn't allow houses to get replaced with less expensive types of housing. So let's talk about how this differs from the new code. So the current code is the organizing principle is around compatible uses. And you saw the map where we prescribe specific uses to specific parts of town. The draft code is what's called a form-based code. And the organizing principle of form-based codes is around compatible forms. So what does this mean? Well, I'll give you an example. These two structures that you see here have very similar forms. They are set back from the street a similar amount. They both have yards. They're similar in height. They have similar setbacks from the sides. You'd say in a lot of ways, these forms are very similar. They're very compatible. But in terms of uses, they're very different. And in terms of our current code, the city treats the structure on the left completely differently from the structure on the right. In fact, any place where you could legally build the structure on the right currently, you could also build an 160-unit apartment building, because the unit on the right is actually a fiveplex and the unit on the left is a single family house. So different uses, same form. On the other side of the equation, we could compare that same house on the left to some condos that have been constructed downtown on the right. In both images, you're seeing 5 units of housing, but the form is very different. And if you took the building on the right and stuck it in the middle of the Bonton district, it would feel grossly out of place. It would be out of form and be out of character. And so the idea of a form-based code is to regulate the kind of form and shape of things, irrespective of how many divisions may or may not exist within those walls. So I'm going to play a short video clip here that can introduce the concept a little bit more and how it relates to this idea of the missing middle.
So when we think about this range of housing types in a form-based approach, we don't start with the thought of thinking about these in terms of densities, but rather thinking about them in terms of intended and compatible form and scale, and or oftentimes thinking about them in terms of a range of building types that might be allowed within different neighborhoods. And so this slide is a really interesting diagram that on your left-hand side illustrates the single-family home. On the right-hand side represents kind of the multi-story mixed-use building. And there's this full spectrum of housing types in the middle that we often call missing middle housing types. And the form-based coding is a really effective tool at regulating that broad range of housing choices, but we found it in particular a really great tool to kind of get communities to be able to provide this range of missing middle types that you see in the middle of that diagram. It's the duplexes, it's the small bungalow courts, it's the small mansion apartments that really have existed in pre-1940s neighborhoods and really help become a really important key of providing those choices throughout a walkable neighborhood. So
this that highlights one of the challenges with our current zoning code. We don't really have zoning districts that are targeted for or allow those types of missing middle housing. In fact, kind of what we've typically seen with the application of our current zoning code is neighborhoods that look like this map that you see on the screen, where we have kind of the separation between areas that are zoned for single family housing that are relatively low density, and then we have small areas that are designated for high density. Those are the R4 and R5 districts, and those really do sometimes feel crowded or feel pretty intense because we've kind of crowded all of that density into kind of small pockets. But there's historical precedent that it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, if you took a walking tour through any of the historic neighborhoods north and south of downtown, you might not realize it, but you'd be walking past not only single family houses, but duplexes and triplexes and fiveplexes like we saw earlier, where they all have similar shapes and forms. They all kind of look like a house in these historic neighborhoods, but they blend into the neighborhood and they provide more They provide more diversity of housing types in the neighborhoods than our current zoning code would allow. So in the Bonton district as it exists today, 60% of the homes in the Bonton district are actually multifamily rentals. But under the current code, in the R1 areas, multifamily, we can't add more multifamily housing to the existing R1 areas of the Bonton. And if for whatever reason, like an existing duplex was bought by an owner and they wanted to convert it back to a single family house, right now that's a one-way valve. So let me explain a little bit about how the form-based code actually works, how it functions, because it's different than our current code, which prescribes a certain number of allowable uses and some kind of forms or some intensities or standards associated with that. With the form-based code, there's a number of different mechanisms that work together to describe an allowable form. So it begins with the allowable lot coverage, which in the RA district would be no more than 40% of the lot can be covered by a building. And that's the same as our current code. It also includes setbacks. So how far back from the edge of the property does the house need to be? And so if you have a front setback and a rear setback, basically that means there'll be a front yard and a rear yard. The draft code adds in parking and open space requirements. So the code calls it amenity space, which says you need 100 or 150 square feet of amenity space per unit within that form. So that ensures that there's a place to barbecue or play bocce ball. Additionally, it places some restrictions on the structure itself. So there's a limit in terms of height that's usually expressed in terms of stories. It also introduces this kind of wonky notion of a wall plate height, which is the maximum height from the base of the building to the base of the roof. In the RA district, that would be it's 25 feet to where the roof begins. So you can't actually go up three true stories unless your ground floor is below grade. When we combine all of these things together, it adds up to this package that prescribes a form that is allowable in a defined district. And I won't go into the details of this too much, but I just wanted to point out that the dimensional allowances between what's in our current code and what's proposed in the draft code are very similar. For example, comparing R1 versus RA, there's been a lot of concerns expressed about the building height. In R1, you can actually build up to 40 feet. In the proposed RA zone, it's capped at 3 stories, but then there's that 25-foot wall plate height. So it's effectively like 2.5 stories. You can go up 2 stories to your roof and build above that. And same thing in the R4 versus RB, R5 versus RC. Those dimensional allowances are quite similar between the two. And I think there's a good conversation to be had as to whether or not those dimensional allowances are the right allowances for our neighborhoods. But the draft code doesn't change those allowances all that much. I'll point out the building size maximum. So in the proposed RA, there's a proposed maximum building size of 10,000 square feet, and people have objected and said that, well, 10,000 square feet, that's a massive building. But if you compare that against a current code, well, there's no limit in the current code. So you can build it beyond 10,000 square feet. It just hasn't been codified like that. So some of it is just kind of how these requirements are messaged or communicated. It can seem alarming when you're like, oh, 10,000 square foot building, but the reality is that's actually more constraining than our current code. Where the code does differ is in the number of allowable units within a package that fits those dimensional allowances. And so the proposed code does increase the number of allowable units relative to R1, R2, and R3. But in R4, it actually reduces the number of allowable units. There are R4 parcels in Bozeman currently that have more than 100 units on them, and the proposed RB form district would be capped at 24. So it kind of, in many cases, the new code is actually more restrictive in terms of what can be developed than the current code. So the organizing principles around these forms or shapes, we could think of these RA as being something that has like roughly the size and mass and a recognizable form of being a house. RB being more of a row house shaped, and RC having something like an apartment shape. And I want to just illustrate this by taking you through some photos of existing structures in our house that would, or existing structures in Bozeman that would conform to these different form-based typologies. So we'll begin with residential A. This is a house on I think South 3rd and Babcock, and it's 3 stories, fits into RA, or more like 2.5 stories, because there's the wall plate height on this is about 20 feet. So you couldn't add another story here. And this is actually a triplex. It looks like a single family house, but it's been internally subdivided at some point into 3 units. So this would be allowable under RA. It's not currently allowable under R1 or R2. This is on South Grand. This looks like a single family house. Again, it's like 2.5 stories. That there is kind of a 3rd story up there, but it doesn't feel like a 3-story home because of that wall plate that ends at about 22 feet. There is another story above that, so that's how you get to 3 stories, but it looks and feels like a house. It used to be a house. These days, it's currently a 5-plex. There's 5 homes in there. This is a 4-plex, kind of more of a recognizable form of a 4-plex. This is a 5-plex. It's designed by Fred Wilson. It's on South Grand, and if you're looking at it from the street, there's mature landscaping in front of it, and it's not, it doesn't tower over its neighbors, but it does provide homes to 5 households. Just a few more images here of some more fourplexes, fiveplexes that are all in the historic neighborhood. Again, these things all have kind of the size and mass and feel of a house. This is actually a sixplex that's on North Church Street, and this is actually 3 true stories, but the ground floor is below grade, and so it's the same height as the single family house next to it. It provides 3 stories, and that would be allowable under RA. But what you can't do under RA is go 3 stories up from the ground. So a couple more modern builds to give you a sense for what this looks like. Triplex. This is on North Black. The wall plate height on the yellow unit on the left might be a little bit higher than allowable, but it's roughly fitting into the form. What wouldn't be allowed is currently in R1, R2, and R3, you can go up 3 stories from the ground. So here's, I have two pictures here of buildings that are currently under construction or have been recently built that are allowable under R1 and not allowable under RA because they're too tall. They go up 3 true stories, and you can do that under the current code. You couldn't do that under the draft code. Same thing also on North Church. It goes up 3 true stories, and that is too tall for the RA district. Here's a few photos of residences that kind of fit the residential B or RB district. The top left, that's a 24-unit apartment building. That's a kitty corner to Wild Crumb. Below that, some newer condos that have been built on Peach Street, and on the right-hand side, another Fred Wilson structure, part of the Atkinson Triangle on campus. There's 12 units inside of there. And then RC, here's some examples of what fits the prescribed form of RC that could go up to 5 stories. You can see that the Village Gateway here on the right, this is a 5-story apartment building. We have examples of these in the community, and when they're appropriately cited, they provide great housing and not in a way that I think folks find offensive or challenging. So I hope that gives you some visuals of the types of forms that are envisioned that would be allowable under the draft code, and ties that back to these ideas of kind of house shape, row house shape, apartment shape. There's a bunch of other important changes that are in the draft code, which I'm not going to go through these in too much detail. I will highlight the fact that it simplifies the development code, and it doesn't change things related to parking requirements in the affordable housing ordinance. I did want to just go through and briefly address a couple common misconceptions that I've heard in the community. One is just looking at that top line, like the allowable number of units, 8 units, 24 units. But you have to remember that that's part of a package. And when you apply all those other dimensional restrictions, you need to have a really big lot to build a 8-unit structure in the RA zone. And if the lot was big enough, you probably wouldn't even notice that it was an 8-plex. The right-hand side shows the result of the simulation that relates the number of units that you could build with respect to parking requirements, amenity space, setbacks, et cetera, and the number of units you could actually get. So it's not the case that 8-unit buildings can go up everywhere. There's a concern that there's going to be a flurry of teardowns associated with the draft code. And the reality is that we don't see a lot of teardowns currently. It's because the economics of doing so aren't great, and the new code doesn't improve that at all. And as an example, you could look, there's a lot of R4 districts that have primarily single family homes, and the allowances in the RB district don't really change much with respect to R4, and they haven't been torn down under the current code. We wouldn't expect to see them torn down under the new code. Lastly, there's this idea that if there is any new housing, it's going to end up as empty second homes or short-term rentals. Well, on the short-term rental side of the City Commission tonight, the short-term rentals, investor-owned short-term rentals are already banned in residential areas, and it looks like those rules are getting stricter. And in residential areas, rates of owner occupancy have actually been trending up in recent years, indicating that at least in the residential areas, I won't speak for downtown, but in residential areas that you actually have more owner occupants in those structures. So I'm gonna wrap up with one thing that the code doesn't do, but we think that it should. Which is to add an additional provision into the code that would ensure that what gets built isn't high-end luxury housing, but rather housing that serves the needs of the community members. And the way that cities like Seattle and Portland and Austin have combined upzoning in a way that produces more affordable housing is by adding this idea of a floor area ratio maximum that tiers with the number of units that get built. Sometimes it gets called a McMansion ban. And the idea is just that you put a cap on how big of a structure that you can build there. And that disincentivizes, or in some cases, makes it impossible to build something large that would be targeted towards the high end of the market. So hopefully that gives just a little bit of information about the current code and the draft code. I'll turn things over to McKeely now to talk about kind of where we're at in terms of the process.
Thank you so much, Mark. And for everybody, my name is McKeely Shannon. So glad to be here with you all today. So there's a couple of key dates and some things that have changed very recently. So there's the Community Development Board that met last week and kind of heard on the map. And then they are slated to have a proposed vote tonight and kind of like go through that together. And so the Community Development Board advises the City Commission, and then the City Commission will have a final vote on this. The City Commission has pushed this somewhere into 2024, like I think around January. So tonight at 6 p.m. is the Development Board's vote on this at 6 p.m. At City Hall in the Commission room. And then if you can go to the next, thank you so much. We know that this is also fast. And so we know that if you all have any questions or want to ask more questions of Mark, or of Alice or of me, we would love for you to do that via this email. It can be forwarded to any one of us. And we would also just love to meet and continue this conversation offline and not on Zoom when there's a time limit, time constraint to this. But yeah, if you would like to go to the meeting tonight for the board meeting, there might be an opportunity to hear what they're talking about and the Community Development Board is talking about. I don't know how much time they might have for public comment. The written comment ended 30 minutes ago, so that is no longer something that you can send in. But you can show up tonight at 6 p.m. If you would like to kind of see like the conversation that is happening in Bozeman. And we would, love to continue this conversation with you all.
Thanks, McKeely. Thank you so much. It's 12:29. I can't believe we just breezed through all of that in 30 minutes. But just to reiterate something McKeely just said, it sounds like the commission is delaying their vote for another couple months. So there is time to continue to dig into this. And it's time that we all deserve to keep talking about it because it is going to dictate how we grow as a community. And our intention is just to be part of that conversation and to say there is grief around the fact that Bozeman's changing and fear around the fact that it will continue to change, and how do we all move forward together, lean towards each other instead of against each other, and think about what it looks like and what we can envision for our community moving forward. So that's the space we're trying to create. And we'll let you know as we move forward from there. But I think getting your feedback about what that format might look like, and how to really give this the time and attention and energy it deserves, it's really appreciated. And with that, I will end the recording. And as today, we are happy to share Mark's slides out after this. I think that would just take an email, and then we're happy to share that. There's a lot of good information on there that we moved quickly through, and then continue the conversation. All right, you all have my email in the invite, and then bozemanNeighbors@gmail.com. Take good care, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, McKeely.